Welcome to the first episode of the Vandenberg Coalition's new series, China and the Homeland. I'm your host, Thor Mortensen. In this series, we'll speak with guests about China's growing influence in the United States, how it affects everyday Americans, and what we can do to stop it. This is an all-hands-on-deck fight, and we need state governments in on the most critical fight of our lifetime. To kick off our series, we'll dive into the recent history of China's United Front strategy, the CCP's mechanism for using every component of its government and business apparatus to subsume American dominance. As we will discuss, this comes to play in how China weaponizes its nationals on American university campuses, controls our critical infrastructure and supply chains, and owns our financial assets, to name a few examples. China is here on American soil and in American industry, and not for our benefit. Our guests will discuss the political context of the United Front broadly, explaining the nature of China's nefariousness and its aims. To kickstart our series, we're excited to be joined by two leading experts in China's malign influence campaign. Michael Lucci is the founder, CEO, and chairman of State Armor, the country's premier subnational security policy organization, where he and his elite team of experts work with state governments to enact consequential policies that keep America secure in the face of rising global threats. Michael was recently appointed by Governor Greg Abbott to the Texas Advisory Committee on Geopolitical Conflict and previously worked for the State Policy Network, Platt Institute, and former Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner. Simply put, you cannot work in the state policy space and talk about China without knowing Michael Lucci. Michael Sobolik is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he focuses on U.S.-China relations and great power competition. He was previously a senior fellow in Indo-Pacific Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council and a legislative assistant to Senator Ted Cruz. Last year, he published Countering China's Great Game, a strategy for American dominance, which was released by Naval Institute Press. And, as all loyal followers of the Vandenberg Coalition know, Michael Sobolik is most importantly an all-star member of our advisory board. So, double the Michaels, double the fun. Thank you both for joining. We're excited to have you here. So, to start with the beginning, I'm going to go ahead and ask each of you to broadly define what China's United Front is, when it first came to being, what the strategy behind it is, and what's its goal. So let's go ahead and start with Michael Lucci, and then Sobolik, you can jump in there too.
The United Front is one of the arms with which the Chinese Communist Party attacks its adversaries. The other most notable arm is the People's Liberation Army, the military. The United Front is a Leninist strategy. I call it simply political warfare, but it's much more nuanced, broad, and sophisticated than that. What the Leninist proposal is to do is to, one, define your primary enemy, that's the United States, and then the allies of the United States. So define the primary enemy, and then go about stripping all allies, friends, colleagues, coworkers from that enemy to isolate that enemy. This is a sort of very broad strategic approach. So you could see it happening across global allies. I mean, our Five Eyes intelligence alliance is very infiltrated. We could say it like that. But what we focus a lot on is domestic resilience. And that's where I think that the United Front hits the homeland. Is the purpose of this political warfare strategy is to gradually erode domestic resilience. There's a lot of ways this manifests. The most obvious is fentanyl. A lot of United Front entities are involved in the mass murder of 100,000 Americans per year through fentanyl poisoning. This is all sourced through China. But you could kind of go down the line. I mean, one of the targets that we investigate is Energy Foundation China. This is a nonprofit, so-called nonprofit, controlled by Beijing, the purpose of which is to make our energy supply chains dependent on Chinese technologies. So green technologies that should be described as red, but think about it at another level. These technologies are coming in full of kill switches. The Attorney General of Texas just began an investigation of one of the battery providers for putting kill switches in the technology that's going into the state of Texas. This is a broad problem. There are kill switches going in. So if you think about eroding resilience, putting kill switches into your enemy's energy grid is a really fantastic way to do that. Go onto campuses, which I describe as wide open. they can do whatever they want on our campuses. They do whatever they want on our campuses. There are Chinese Student Scholar Associations amongst other entities. These are identified by our State Department as arms or wings of the United Front project. So what do these CSSAs do? I mean, obviously they steal intellectual property. They harass and even assault enemies of the Chinese Communist Party. And they're involved in broad transnational repression, silencing of critics, whether those are Chinese nationals, Taiwanese, Hong Kongers, or just Americans as well. And of course, they're involved in broad espionage. So United Front is a broad political warfare concept. It's deployed within the United States to erode all of our domestic resilience, from higher education institutions, energy grid, and so on. And if we don't get quite serious about countering this, I say sanction it and deport all of them. It will just continue to erode our domestic strength.
Great. Thank you for that. Michael Sobolik, do you want to go ahead and add anything?
Sure, I would love to. So all of those, I'm just going to call him Lucci because of the two Michaels. It'll just be easier for me, for us to distinguish. Everything Lucci said was spot on in terms of the intensity and the seriousness of the threat that United Front work poses to the United States and to the American people. And this whole concept of it being Leninist is the best starting point for it, because you can't understand United Front work through a democratic lens, because democracies don't really have an analog to United Front work. And the reason for it is because it stems not just from Leninist party building, but from Marxist ideas about how the world works. So when Lenin, back in the early 20th century, was thinking about party building, he was looking at it from the ideological construct of Marxism. And Marx obviously had this system with the global revolution of communism, where you have late stage capitalism, where eventually the proletariat becomes empowered. And then eventually this proceeds through revolution to a perfecting of the political situation into communism. But Lenin, ever the realist and not just an ideologue, realized that you had to make temporary alliances along the way towards the slow but steady global march toward communism. And United Front work was basically the encapsulation of that recognition that you need temporary alliances with people who are like friendly enough with your cause in the short term. So for instance, the people in like the Western European countries in the 20th century who were the beneficiaries of imperialism, as Lenin put it, he needed them to become opposed to global imperialism, because that's obviously, from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, the biggest, baddest thing about capitalism is imperialism. And if the communists could foment revolution in the global South and then disconnect the imperial acquisitions from the imperial home base, so to speak, you can not only liberate through nationalism these poorer countries and get them on the communist path, but you can also partner with capitalist and wealthy countries who hate exploiting other countries. I say all that because I know that's a lot to follow, but I say all that because you go about that, if you're a Marxist-Leninist, by making temporary alliances with people who hate the same thing you hate in the short run. So this is the hallmark of United Front work. The party needs something that capitalist countries have. That is either a political coalition or it is a technology or something. And United Front work is all about asking, who is my friend and who is my enemy? Classic question that Mao Zedong posited to the Red Army and the ragtag proto-CCP followers in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And United Front work recognizes that even though there are a lot of capitalists out there that are not true believers in communism, we can make temporary alliances along the way to get something that we need from them. And if you're a friend of the Communist Party today, you could easily become an enemy tomorrow. And that's why what Lucci said about the connection between the People's Liberation Army, or back in the mid 20th century, the Red Army, when the CCP was a ragtag like revolutionist organization. It's a left hook and a right hook. They both go hand in hand because, like, just to put it bluntly, United Front work is not exclusively but broadly based in deception. The PLA is hard power. And this is nothing new. Like, disinformation and deception and strength and military might have gone hand in hand through all of human existence. But this is how Marxist-Leninist entities like the CCP conceptualize it. So you cannot understand United Front work without understanding it, as Lucci said, as this approach to political warfare. That's exactly what it is.
Great. Thank you both for that political and historical context. That was an excellent overview. Lucci, circling back to what you were discussing in the different areas that we see the United Front, can you talk a little bit about where they're targeting specific industries, specific locations in the United States? You mentioned higher education. Let's just talk about the scope and the scale that we're seeing right now.
I would assess that higher education is their number one target. And it was that way at the beginning when they partnered with the nationalists in education within China, sapped power from the nationalists, sapped know-how and expertise from the nationalists, and then used that against them in the Chinese Civil War. They're doing a very similar move on the United States. So they are sapping power from the United States through, vacuuming up as much intellectual property and legitimate expertise as they can, which then goes back to China in many cases and is used to build up their military, weaponize technologies against us, and make us dependent on things that we actually created in the long run. But the second thing where I see concern, so these are the two gaps where I think that Washington D.C. is just kind of missing the game. Is one is higher education, and two is to look at the industrial footprint of Chinese entities within the United States and looking at how those are dual use on a really bad day. And so how they tap into our critical infrastructure. And this is a lot of this is Chinese companies, so to speak, doing this, how they tap into our critical infrastructure, get close to our military bases. There was a recent expose by Philip Lenzicki about a couple Chinese Canadians right next to Whiteman Air Force Base. But that comes after, in the state of Texas, there was a former PLA general who had a 10,000-foot runway, 140,000 acres surrounding Laughlin Air Force Base. You had Fufeng, which is this very party-tied ag company that was building grain silos next to Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota. So those are the two things that where there's United Front influence on all these entities, but they're campus operations where there's truly almost nothing going on American campuses to protect those campuses. And then the industrial footprint and how that doubles on a really bad day, but is also useful for signals collection, espionage, sabotage, in between here and there. Those are the two big areas where I think that there's not seriousness in the American project at countering what China is doing in those two fronts, amongst many others. But those two are, I think, at crisis level points.
Thanks. Excellent. We're really excited that next episode we'll be joined by your colleague at State Armor, Jackie Deal, to dive a little bit more into the higher education element. And we'll also talk about infrastructure later on in the series, too. So that's a great overview. Michael Sobolik, can you talk about what Washington has been doing, or the lack thereof? How have the last 10 months under the second Trump administration looked, and even before that?
Congress began to freak out about United Front work late 2017, early 2018. So, as you mentioned, Thor, I previously worked for Senator Ted Cruz. And the first project that any elected member of Congress had exposing and even just talking about United Front work came to the forefront in, I believe, the first month of 2018, when a journalist at the Washington Post scooped a letter that Senator Cruz sent to the president of University of Texas, Austin. And the letter said, we understand that the China-U.S. CUSEF, it was China-U.S. Exchange Foundation, I think is the name of this group, And they routinely go across the country doling out money and saying, we'll fully fund exchange programs. All you need to do is say yes. And then you have a two-way street where you have PRC students coming here, you have American students going over there. And it's not only a way to sow through money and funding and exposure of U.S. students certain messages and narratives about the party. It's a foothold for more CCP money and influence to come in. And there are other organizations at other think tanks like Foundation for Defense of Democracies that have done great research on how Confucius Institutes in particular are a harbinger of more CCP influence in universities and really like starting point and not just the be all end all of this stuff. But anyways, Congress was like, oh my goodness, these are like CCP controlled organizations with a lot of money coming to universities in our states, in our districts, and they want to fully fund everything. It's hard to say no to that. So Cruz sent this letter and he said, you need to understand this is an intelligence threat. It's a national security threat. And the president of UT Austin did the right thing. He said, thanks, but no thanks. And the LBJ school turned down the gift from CUSEF, which was great. And that kicked off this campaign of a ton of other representatives and senators looking at their states and their districts and saying, well, wait a second, if that's happening in Texas, what's going on in my district? And you had then Senator Marco Rubio sending multiple letters to different universities all throughout Florida saying, hey, what's up with these Confucius Institutes? And this snowball started to come and accumulate. And now you can't really talk about China policy at all in Washington without talking about United Front work, which is good, as it should be. But I would argue we don't have a lot to show for that, for at least a few reasons. One of them being Congress, again, Senator Cruz was in the middle of this in 2018, if I remember correctly, or 2019, legislating via the Defense Authorization Act, prohibitions and limitations on Confucius Institute's ability to operate on U.S. campuses that take money from the Pentagon. However, there was a huge loophole in that bill that became very apparent in the coming years. All the Confucius Institutes had to do was change their names, and then they wouldn't legally fall under that prohibition anymore. It's a bit of a cat and mouse game, but then the other issue that's even bigger than that is the amount of political will that you need to really mobilize a democracy like ours to be in a political warfare setting without actually being in a shooting match it has been historically difficult for the United States to achieve. And Lucci mentioned a few examples as to like a lack of seriousness or urgency. Another one is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, a woefully outdated piece of legislation that is in dire need of being updated in Washington. State Armor, and I think Lucci and your team, like, you guys deserve so much credit for going to state capitals and saying, you can't wait for Washington to update this. You need to take this step and figure out how foreign influence from adversary countries is infiltrating your capital. And you guys have had great success with that. Washington, largely because of K Street interests and foreign interests, has been quite slow to update for, like, it's abbreviated FARA, but it's Foreign Agents Registration Act. And to me, that is one of those things where I will believe that DC is truly serious about this when we update our foreign influence lobbying rules and take it from the 20th century into the 21st century, because it doesn't account for United Front work. There are glaring loopholes in there. And we've got to take this seriously, and I think we still have a long ways to go.
Thanks for outlining that. Now kicking it down to the crux of what this series is all about, to the state level. Michael, you've been working in this arena for a while, Michael Lucci, that is. Can you take us through what you're seeing on the subnational level, where states have been successful, what obstacles you're running into, and just scope out the scene for us broadly?
So Texas and Nebraska are 1A and 1A amongst states in getting at this threat. They are far ahead of where Congress is, really across almost every area. For one example, the state of Nebraska did enact a Foreign Agent Registration Act, and lo and behold, every lobbyist for a Chinese entity all of a sudden dropped the client, except for one, actually. NetChoice, which is home of Alibaba, which the White House just identified as being involved in targeting and attacking Americans in America on behalf of the PLA. NetChoice holds Alibaba as a member, and they don't want to have to go through the foreign agent registration in Nebraska. So it looks like what they did is they separated from their lobbyist, then created a new organization, which is NetChoice, and two members of NetChoice, Meta and Google. They're represented by the same lobbyist. I suspect that law looks through that kind of nonsense, and they're still subject to it anyways. But Nebraska on the foreign agent registration has done incredible work really across areas. Texas actually took a little bit of a different approach on the foreign agent registration. Texas simply said, you cannot accept payment for lobbying on behalf of a foreign adversary. Little did we know that should have been included in that bill, foreign terrorist organization as well, because the governor of Texas just designated a couple organizations as terrorists, and they actually lobby in the state house. So had we known, perhaps we would have put into that law, no terrorist organizations can be paying lobbyists as well. But those are getting at the influence issues. Texas has really done a whole of government response. They have a geopolitical conflict stress test, as you mentioned earlier. That's just a complete resilience test, getting ready for if China goes after Taiwan. They did a higher education omnibus bill, really cleaning out a lot of influence across 8, 9, or 10 different areas. Banning genomic sequencers from the Chinese Communist Party. So they did about 15 different distinct actions this year. And Nebraska has done about the same, aggregated over a couple years. Texas does legislation every other year. So they're in an odd numbered years, not an even numbered years. So supply chain resilience, banning procurement of Chinese technologies, as the governor of Texas did by executive order. Nebraska did that through statute. Just broad resilience. I think that the important thing at the state level is they understand that they have agency. They can't go solve the first island chain issue. They can't really solve the rare earth issue, although they could perhaps play some role in those things, but they have agency on resilience. And if we get resilience right, a lot of other problems are going to fade away. And so you're seeing that. Now, I mentioned 2 states because they've been so fantastic. I mean, Florida's been incredible. Tennessee, Arizona with split governments, done a lot of incredible work. The first laws on transnational repression in the world, I believe, were Texas, then Nebraska, then Arizona this year. And you're going to see those laws start biting on really enemy actors within the United States, I think pretty soon within the state of Texas. So there's a lot going on, supply chain, critical infrastructure, political warfare, where you have this broad counterattack coming from these leading states.
That's great. And just one question to follow up on that. You talked about resilience being the advantage that states have, and many being aware. In the states you didn't mention, where that may be behind the North Stars of Texas and Florida and Nebraska, when I talk to people, I get the question a lot that where is the line between the federal government and the state government? How do you respond to that and kind of point state legislators into the right direction?
What has been the prerogative of the states for 250 years of our country? They've always regulated education. They've always regulated land purchases. They've always been the lion's share of law enforcement. They've always, been looking at critical infrastructure since we've kind of had critical infrastructure in the modern context. The vast majority of resilience issues rest with the states. President Trump recognized this in an executive order they issued on March 18th, where he said states need to be leading on all this. The federal government's going to provide expertise and hopefully funding for supporting some of these things, but the states need to lead on resilience. It has been their prerogative. Who as we could see, under the federal FARA, there are less than 24 agents registered on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. Just the state of Nebraska has wiped out about that amount through the state FARA law. And Nebraska is, of course, not the largest state in the country. So these areas where resilience can be enacted and where resilience matters have always been the prerogative of the states. That's not to say that the federal government shouldn't be doing these things. They absolutely should. But whereas we need a federal law on transnational repression, how many FBI agents are there to enforce that law versus how many state and local law enforcement officers in the state of Texas? It's multiples. Just Texas versus FBI, it's multiples of officers who can be enforcing transnational repression at the state level versus the federal officers available to do the same.
Michael Sobolik, we've talked about the breadth of the threat to China and how they creep into all sorts of industries and higher education, critical infrastructure. And it seems at times that they're always one step ahead of us. What advantages do we as the United States have against this threat? Is there any way that we can get ahead of them in our own homeland?
I think the way the Chinese Communist Party thinks about national security is so totally different from the way the United States does. Peter Mattis, who is the president at Jamestown Foundation, has made this point repeatedly, and I bear it out in my own thinking constantly, that the CCP does not view national security as an exercise in threat mitigation, but in threat elimination. They have built a techno-authoritarian state that if you're someone like Hassan Piker, who was in China recently, like you look at this and you are amazed by it and you're very impressed by it and you like want to live in a country like that, which I think is really creepy and weird. But most people look at it and are rightly troubled by what the People's Republic of China is and what the Chinese Communist Party has been for a long time. It's impressive that they have the ability to conduct high-tech AI-powered surveillance and censorship, and they have the capacity to do something like transnational repression, which, like, let's put euphemisms aside. Transnational repression is essentially claiming that the CCP has no borders on its jurisdiction. That's basically what it is. It's saying that no matter who you are in the world or where you are in the world, if you do something that the CCP doesn't like, and especially if you're a PRC national, it doesn't matter whose soil you're on, you are the parties, and we will force you to comply with our dictates. In some ways, it's impressive that they have the ability to do that, but the fact that the party feels the need to do that is so unimpressive, and it betrays a deep political, even ideological insecurity that the Chinese Communist Party is beset with. And I think one of our biggest examples, and listen, for all of the issues that we have as Americans, we're celebrating what, it's like 250 years soon. Like, we've had our share of issues. We don't have that problem. Like, we have had, I think, a very responsible approach historically to what national security is, which is it's impossible to eliminate every single threat. So you mitigate them. You do the best with what you have in an imperfect world. And American statecraft, I think, has a compelling history of success by and large with that approach. So what's our biggest advantage? We're not afraid of our own shadow like the CCP is, and we are not obsessively committed to bending every corner of the world to our own controlled narrative. So the fact that the party feels the need to do this, number one, like the best net or response that we have is Title 18 in the U.S. Code, which protects, among many things, anyone violating or trying to take away the constitutional rights of Americans. So, I mean, Lucci is right when he says that it's really a capacity problem and a manpower problem. Because I think at the federal level, like, we have at least what we need with authorities to start hitting back at this transnational repression stuff, but we don't have political clarity and we don't have enough people at DOJ and FBI to do it. But we have, in terms of on paper, we have at least enough to get started, I think. But really, our biggest advantage is going on offense, at least with baby steps, like talking about this rhetorically to the American people and to the rest of the world, not as, oh my goodness, the CCP is so evil, we need to hit them back, and we do, and they are evil. But we need to shine a light on them in the way that I think Reagan did with communism and the Soviets, and just kind of laugh at them too. And maybe not in a flippant way, but make some jokes about it, because it is it is rather ridiculous that they go to these lengths or that they feel the need to at all. And I think that the CCP is so obsessed with narrative and information control that getting in that domain and putting them in their proper place of this is not a 10-foot tall giant, even though they have impressive tools. This is really a weak, brittle regime, as many Leninist regimes are. We shouldn't be afraid to say that. We shouldn't be afraid at all. If anything, it'll probably make the situation more stable and not less stable because they know that we recognize the power balance appropriately.
Do you have any CCP jokes off the top of your head you care to share?
This is the first time anyone's ever asked that in a podcast, and I don't. But honestly, like maybe we should. Like we should have those in our back pockets, and that will be my homework assignment from this episode, Thor.
For listeners too, that's your homework assignment.
That's right.
One final question for the both of you, real quick, before we wrap up. Why does this all matter? Whether the listeners are in DC and our network, state legislators, or just average Americans in the heartland, why should listeners care about what China is doing in our homeland and how our states are responding to it? We'll start with Sobolik and then go to Lucci to wrap it up.
How the Chinese Communist Party treats their own people is a preview of how they want to treat the rest of the world. And I think this is the duality of United Front work. Because we're Americans, we talk about how United Front work impacts us, and rightly so. But United Front work historically has been first and foremost about work inside of China. Because remember, these are Marxist-Leninists. They actually believe in an ongoing revolution, as any good communist does. So if the revolution needs to keep moving, then whoever your friend and your enemy is, that is by nature going to be shifting as the political conditions on the path to revolution change. So when we look at what China is doing inside of their own borders to the Uyghurs, to Hong Kongers, to Tibetans, to Inner Mongolians, and what they want to do to Taiwan, that's a preview. And when we see instances of transnational repression here in the United States, we can't bifurcate those two things. They are connected. The world that Xi Jinping wants to make does not stop at the waters of Taiwan. It goes to the heartland of America and Nebraska. Think back in 2018 or so, when a U.S. employee of Marriott Hotels lost a job for liking a tweet from the Dalai Lama. And they did that because China leaned on Marriott and forced them to fire that employee. That is only a preview of the kind of world that we have waiting for us if the Chinese Communist Party continues to be on the ascent, and if we do not have a good answer for United Front work. It is a dangerous thing to be on the receiving end of these kinds of malign operations. And I think Americans need to see that what happens here on our soil with CCP malign influence is a manifestation of Xi Jinping's and the Chinese Communist Party's global ambitions, and it is not a pretty picture.
Michael Lucci, take us home.
If you rewind 20 years, so 2005, and you think about the threat China posed to us at that time, particularly in our homeland, it was nearly non-existent. I mean, they were doing espionage, they were stealing secrets, but they didn't have a real ability to project power here, nor would it have been wise for them to try to do so because of the response that it would have engendered. But over 20 years, through subterfuge, through nuance, through political warfare, they've developed capacities within the United States to do incredible amounts of damage. They kill the number one cause of death, again, of military-age Americans is fentanyl, and they're doing this intentionally. But critical infrastructure, espionage, and so on. So if you do that 20-year thought experiment and then look forward 20 years, what does that look like? So what does 2045 look like? If they're able to execute the next 20 years as well as they've executed on the past 20 years, it's going to be a very bad world. And so that's true for Americans, but that's true for, people who want some notion of freedom around the world. And, one of the things I think about, sometimes I post about this, I post about it in Greek and nobody knows what it means. Aeschylus, in his play The Persians, I believe it was, he described the Athenians rowing into battle against the Persians. I think it's the Battle of Salamis. And they actually sang a song. And I think that song is worth visiting. But they describe this is the fight for everything. So you're fighting for all of Western civilization. The Athenians did to birth Western civilization, 480 BC. But we're facing the same fight here. This is the fight for Western civilization. The Nazi threat was tremendous. The Soviet threat was tremendous. But the threat from the Chinese Communist Party and the capacities they have actually dwarf what was developed by the Nazis relative to the United States and by the Soviets relative to the United States and our allies. So this is the largest threat we've ever faced. It is the fight for everything. And it is a fight that thus far, and perhaps continuing in the future, is not going to be so immediate that it will clearly arouse the American people to immediate action. If and when that day comes, that day might actually be too late at that point. So it's the fight for everything. It's a different kind of fight. It's the greatest adversary we've ever faced. And we need to wake up to it very quickly and get serious about it very quickly, or understand that 20 years from now, it's going to be a very ugly world and we could have stopped it.
Well, Michael Lucci of State Armor, Michael Sobolik of the Hudson Institute, and our advisory board member, thank you very much for a timely, at times scary, and at times hopeful discussion. We really appreciate you kickstarting our new series, and we're excited to talk about this over the next 6 or so episodes. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to China in the Homeland, a production of the Vandenberg Coalition. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, leave a review, and tune in again as we explore the role of states in confronting the China challenge. Also, please follow our account on X @VandenbergCo, visit www.vandenbergcoalition.org, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Beyond the Water's Edge, to keep up to date on all our other projects. Until next time, I'm Thor Mortensen, and this has been China in the Homeland.